Hi again, church family. Pastor Michael here. We're now into week 3 of our COVID-19 isolation slash social distancing, and with that, we've noticed that we've lost a number of things. Not just lost community, but there may be some events that people had on their calendar that seem to have now vanished. And I was really looking forward to X, whatever that was, and then there's a loss of that. There's a grief of that. And so sometimes we as Christians think, well, how am I supposed to deal with that? And so today I just want to just kind of talk into this concept of grief and loss. People do share a common response to grief. That's one thing that's interesting. Way back in 1969, a psychiatrist by the name of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, she introduced what has become known as the 5 stages of grief. There's denial, which is this isn't happening, and we certainly have probably gone through that. Anger, why is this happening? Who's to blame for this? Bargaining, which is okay, you know what? Make this go away, and I will in return do. And sometimes you play that with God a bit, which we got to be real careful. There's depression. I'm too sad to do anything, and then acceptance. Finally I get to the place of it, and I accept it, and I'm at peace with what has happened. That is one kind of synopsis, stages of grief. And you may go through them, some of them quickly and some of them really slowly. Later on in the psychologist world, a gentleman by the name of William Worden, he gave us different stages to pass through and how to manage through loss. And he states that we need to accept the reality of the loss. Okay? That's good. I accept that there's a loss there. But then second, we need to process the hurt and the pain caused by this loss. Because there is a hurt and there is pain. We also need to find a way to adjust to the new normal now that the world has changed. It's fascinating. I don't think he's really talking about, in this circle, he's not talking about a pandemic that we find ourselves, but rather grief and loss that we find in a death. But it so applies. Find a way to adjust to the new normal. And then finally he says to find an enduring connection while moving forward. And that's sometimes easier with a death of someone. This finding a way to incorporate memories of that person into your new activities that you're doing. It's harder now, though, with the loss that we find ourselves in. Loss in the area of the coronavirus pandemic, it means finding a way to create and develop meaning in our lives in the midst of uncertainty. And although these are common responses to loss, there is no structure, there is no timetable for grieving and the grieving process. I do like the way that the other cultures deal with grief and loss rather than the North American style. We tend to hang on to it and a lot longer, whereas others kind of process it for a week and get it all over and done with, and emotionally they're out there. But we all tend to deal with it differently. That being said, understanding grief and its common symptoms are helpful when grieving. They're helpful, of course, but let us not also miss the biblical instruction for dealing with grief. And you may think, well, what are you talking about? I don't recall a biblical reference on how to grieve. And it's not specific, and yet they are there. And I'll give you 2 biblical references that will help us. First one is 1 Thessalonians 4:13. And it says this. He says, "We do not want you to be uninformed about those who sleep in death, so that you do not grieve like the rest of mankind who have no hope. Now, this, of course, has to do with the loss of someone physically, a death. And yet, I think it can apply to the type of loss that we're experiencing now. Here, Paul, who is writing, gives us helpful instructions on how to process through loss, process through grief. Notice first that it doesn't say not to grieve. It's not saying that we don't need to grieve. Like the British would say, stiff upper lip and all that. What? It assumes that we will grieve. We do not want you to be uninformed about those who sleep in death so that you do not grieve like. So it's assuming that you're actually going to grieve. It is important to grieve. So it really instructs grieve. It's okay. It's good and it's right. We grieve genuinely and unapologetically. Death, yes, tragic. Loss is just as tragic. Loss is also sorrowful. It's good to grieve, and this text actually gives us permission to. And yet Paul also gives us instruction on that we grieve like someone with no hope. He says, even though we do grieve, we grieve differently from those around us who have no hope. We, as followers of Jesus Christ, have hope. As one writer wrote, he says, Christians experience grief but without despair, sorrow but without defeat, sadness but without hopelessness. It's true sorrow and true hope. Now, these things don't cancel each other out, by the way. We feel the weight of sorrow and yet also the great thrill of hope. In moments of deep sadness, we actually feel both. Why? Because we are going through the experience, we need to grieve, and yet also because we have the hope in Jesus Christ. You see, the start of the next verse points to this. In 1 Thessalonians 4:14, it starts off with, "For we believe that Jesus died and rose again." If it wasn't for Jesus, we'd have no hope. But Jesus rose again, so we have the greatest hope possible. So yes, grieve, but with hope. It's important those two kind of marry together. We grieve in times of loss, and our grief may last a day, many days, weeks. The pain is real, the sorrow is real, so the grief is real, but we grieve hopefully, hopeful, because we are convinced we grieve just temporarily. It's no wonder that Paul actually concludes this whole passage in 1 Thessalonians 4 with the phrase, "Therefore encourage one another with these words." Encourage one another in hope, please. We're all grieving. We're all have loss. So encourage one another with the hope that is found in Jesus Christ. The other reference, I said there was two. The other reference for me is one of the shortest verses in the Bible. It's John 11:35. And it simply says, Jesus wept. I had said in a previous video that Jesus understands our isolation because he experienced it. He also understands our grief and our loss because he experienced it. We have a Savior that understands. On the death of his friend Lazarus, even though Jesus knows of the hope of the resurrection, even though he knew of the final outcome, Jesus wept. He still showed the emotion of the grief and the loss. So we are definitely allowed to go there, like Jesus. But like Jesus, we don't stay there. We don't stay in the emotion of grief and loss. We move forward with the hope of the resurrection, just like Paul points to in 1 Thessalonians, just as Jesus modeled for us. We grieve for a time. It's loss. It's okay. And then we move forward because of the hope that we have in resurrection. which we look forward to on Easter Sunday celebration. Be blessed. If you have any questions or you want to connect, please feel free to contact either myself or Pastor Aaron. We'd love to chat. Take care.